Holy fuck, the final battle has come and so have I. Despite a slow start, this episode brings the action to new heights, not just by teaming up our lovely main characters, but by assembling one hell of an animation lineup. Even at the top line of this episode, we have Kazuya Kurosawa behind the direction and storyboard this week. I've of course sung his praises for how he handled Broly vs Vegeta and the first Tamagami fight, but I was a little disappointed by what he brought to the table with Vegeta's attempt. Thankfully, that was but a rare stumble because he sure returns in full force here with a board packed to the brim with not just powerful angles for stills, but seriously impressive choreography. He's a director whose strengths lie in his ability to bring the environment into the picture, either through characters straight up interacting with components within the world, or simply flying the camera through the world in the midst of the action. For example, let's look at this scene from JoJo star Nobuhiro Nagata and Isamu Takara. This is the latter's first bit of action on the show for some reason, having previously handled mainly dialogue scenes, and that's a bit of a shame because this is fantastic. It's especially emblematic of Kurosawa's boarding, with the way we see Vegeta dodging across the pipes and it breaking, and of course the way he sends Vegeta flying into loose debris of the floating island. It goes a very long way in making the characters feel like they're actually fighting within a real space rather than battling in the void with a variety of backgrounds just kind of moving behind them. Takara is an interesting animator, largely thanks to his line work. It's got a very distinctive quality to it. The effect shapes are cool, absolutely, but the edges have almost a kind of hatched look to them, and I think that stands out the most if you look at the way the lines are etched in on the debris, which blends really well with the other animator here and how they drew the floor. It's a very carefully curated looseness that I think is really appealing. But of course, a storyboard is only as good as the animators that execute it, and I think it does have some moments where the staff let it down a little. Winding back a bit, the battle between Goku and Majin Buu kicks off with the one and only Tadayoshi Yamamuro. I've spent the past couple of weeks being surprisingly impressed by his output on the show. I of course spent much of Super frustrated by his design work, but he's been doing really competent animation under Nakatsuru's lead on Daima. Unfortunately, his work here is quite lackluster. The ideas behind the choreography are cool, but Yamamura animates these concepts so slowly that I think it sucks all of the energy out of the opening battle of this episode, combined with some weirdly stiff posing, and unfortunately it all comes away feeling a little bit underwhelming. There's one nice cut here that's been redrawn by the wonderful Kozue Komatsu, and some moments where I can kind of see the vision, but alas, it's just not quite the big bang I think this episode wanted to kick off with. With him being on all but one of the past 7 episodes and looking to be providing more assistance on episode 18, maybe he simply stretched himself too thin. Either way, that energy sure comes flying back in when Takeshi Morita takes over. He's a real asset to this show already in the action department, but this is easily his best contribution yet, and I think that's because this feels like Morita at his most unrestrained. The close-up of Buu in particular being punched has all of that iconic line work all scrunched up in the nose area with neat shading, and there's even a bit of gum showing next to gritted teeth. And of course, when you then look at the animation that follows, you get a real playful sense despite the intensity. I love the rallying of the ki blast, and all throughout is making full use of Buu's stretchiness to facilitate so many fun poses. It's just a non-stop dizzying battle of pure hype, and I loved it. It did such a great job of raising the stakes before Gomar jumps in. But before we do jump into the sheer insanity of this episode's phenomenal second half, I do want to finish up by praising Kurosawa's very subtle fan service with him bringing back Kaioshin's iconic smug face, and of course the great nod to Chala Head Chala as Goku runs over the wall. With many other shows going for cheap callbacks, I think this is probably the best way to approach things. I also can't move on without mentioning the character art in this episode. Takeo Ide takes on the chief animation supervisor role for only the second time on the show, but it's Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru who once again jumps in and virtually erases him in the entire first half. That's only a good thing though, because Nakatsuru's style continues to just sit so far above everyone else's. But unlike Ide's last appearance, you can definitely still see his involvement during much of the action. He's never been my favorite stylistically, but he clearly did well enough to be left untouched in spots, and it looks pretty damn good. After a quick scene from French animator Nightbreed, who I mentioned 2 episodes back, the stage is set and the team up begins with industry veteran Ken Otsuka jumping behind the wheel. He's done a shitload of excellent work on the series thus far, but his last appearance appearance was kind of lackluster, and I theorized maybe he was cooking something for this finale. It's an interesting scene because although it's well animated, it also seems intentionally not flashy. It's a scene that serves as connective tissue between the most hype moments of this episode, and it's one that's supposed to demonstrate how completely immovable Gomar is. And so you have all of these great setups and none of the follow-through, which maybe sounds odd, but I think works for what this is meant to convey. It's bookended by a scene that shows Gomar retaliating, and there's weight behind those punches, which I think contrasts with the lack of it before really nicely. It firmly establishes the complete mismatch in power here. 2 episodes back, I sung all the praises for Shuichiro Manabe, dropping one of the best sequences on Daima yet, and it sure speaks to the show's schedule that he's back so soon with yet another great scene and another flip. He likes flips. Although infinitely shorter, it showcases some of the fighting styles Kurosawa conjured up for Gomar here, using magic to pull boulders down to block Shin and Glorio's attacks, and then having Do and Ku pierce through them to catch Gomar off guard. To follow that up with a fucking double team Inazuma kick from Piccolo and Vegeta, it's just the icing on the cake. Although it has no effect, I think the speed of it all really starts to ramp up that intensity again. There's a narrative to the battle forming here. And it's at this point that the shackles of the show's production come off completely. Hiromi Ishigami makes her return after an astonishing debut on episode 11, executing such a fucking insanely tough scene for everyone involved. Kurosawa has always been a director who loves to move the camera. We saw as much on episode 8, but he goes all in here, and I'm glad both Ishigami and the CG team were able to make this work, because holy shit is it impressive. The iconic brushstrokes are back and her layouts feel colossal. This is the biggest Daima has felt yet, and who better to take over than the one and only Ryo Onishi. Holy fuck, where do I even begin here? This is literally 3.5 minutes, all from one man. A man who just did a whole minute of character animation last episode. A man who did 5 minutes on a fucking movie. This is perhaps the most emblematic of Daima's production schedule yet, that this was even possible. Despite how completely crazy his scenes are, Onishi's not an animator that embodies the usual stylistic snappiness that you see in the majority of action anime scenes. He's very much someone who embodies bounce. There's a realistic weightiness to the way his animation moves, even when it's doing completely larger than life stuff. Even something as simple as Goku throwing a punch comes with a weighty wobble to it. It stops the movement feeling overly linear and breaks it up with additional movement. You can see it in other parts, like where Gomar fires at Shin and Glorio. A more traditional animator would hold the pose as the blasts fire, but Onishi just keeps going with a subtle leg movement before he then spins off into the distance. A lot of the distinctive bounciness in Onishi's work also comes from his extremely liberal use of smears. It's taking squash and stretch, one of the core principles of animation, to the absolute max. In literally every movement, Onishi's throwing in such intense smears that cause characters to essentially become jelly before snapping back on model once again. It results in movement that feels weighty and human while simultaneously feeling completely larger than life. What makes him so fucking special is that he achieves all of this while pulling off totally batshit camera work. I already praised the CG background integration with Ishigami's scene, but it's on a completely different level here. There is such an insane level of ambition happening across these 3.5 minutes that I am amazed they pulled it off so seamlessly. Kurosawa and Onishi are a match made in heaven, and I think that's no truer than the rocky rotation part as the gang power up their beams like plan to eradicate the Saiyans. To animate that many characters rotating like that is just completely inhuman. I think what's interesting too is that Onishi used to animate with pencil and paper, but swapped to digital in the middle of 2023. You can see this most clearly in some of his impact frames, which, although cool, exhibit very simple digital brushwork. It's certainly not all like that, but I thought it was quite interesting to see how effective simplicity can be. The reason I bring it up, though, is that oftentimes digital animators can pull off this level of camera complexity and seamless integration by working with rendered background animation out of Blender first. By having the sequence's 3D background moments mapped out like this first, it means that what you then end up animating shooting fits completely perfectly within that space. I obviously can't say definitively, but given the recent switch to digital and the way the scene's camera work feels so flawlessly integrated into every bit of movement, I feel fairly certain this is probably the approach he took. What's funny is that the part where Gomar reflects all their attacks back at them reminded me a hell of a lot of One Piece legend Katsumi Ishizuka's animation, and he's another superstar who recently went digital. That's probably just a coincidence, of course, but I wanted to mention it either way. That aside, this whole masterful sequence ends with what just feels like a real beautiful summation of all of the creative ideas that have gone into this. Onishi's endless rotations as Goku transforms just keep going, and it's all framed against the backdrop of Do and Tamagami 1 jumping in to hold Gomar's attack back. It's a masterclass of visual storytelling and technical animation, a whole new level of ambition for an animator that was already at the very top of the studio. What a crazy episode this turned out to be. I certainly have some thoughts on the music and how it affected the intensity of this battle, but when it comes to motion outside of that Yamamuro scene, this was virtually flawless. Nikatsuru made the dialogue look fantastic, and then with the action, man, everything from Marita right up to Onishi's closer made this the best looking Daima episode yet. If these 3 episodes managed to maintain even 80% of what this episode offered, we're in for one of the coolest climaxes to a Dragon Ball show yet. Next week is a huge one plot-wise, and I want to give you a heads up now. Please stay away from YouTube and social media until you see it, otherwise you will absolutely get spoiled. Otherwise, until then, be sure to rate this video, let me know what you thought, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you next time.